Thanks very much, Franco. It's a pleasure to be back with the ESEE colleagues once again, and the community here. I won't ask how many of you were here 25, 24 years ago, but we'll ask that next year when you come. So what we're going to be doing today is looking into the future for agricultural extension and education, looking into the crystal ball to see what's going to be happening for extension and education. I think when we talk about our common future, or the future that we all want, a lot of people refer to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and things like zero hunger, quality education, gender equality. But how do these SDGs match with the reality that we have in our profession in terms of practitioners, research, and key thinkers in extension and education? Coming from IFPRI, one important place that I think to look about what's going on in ag development is the IFPRI flagship policy, the food policy, global food policy report, which talks about major developments in policies and it looks ahead. So this year's, looking back at 2018, looking ahead at 2019, focuses on rural revitalization to address crises in rural areas. And what we've been seeing over the past year is that despite a lot of economic growth, for instance, in 2018, we have still undernourishment, hunger, malnutrition, 821 million people in the world facing chronic food deprivation. There's also been trade protectionism. We've seen the trade wars with the US and China. We've seen a lot of anti-globalization sentiment. But we've also seen trade partnerships coming up within Asia, within Africa, for instance. On the environment front, a lot of pluses and negatives, not so much progress. There's the anti-science sentiment, and we've had a lot of climate shocks in the past year or so, which also helped to drive this food security and malnutrition issues. There's been crises and conflicts, Yemen, South Sudan, Venezuela, all continuing to contribute to these issues of poverty and food insecurity. And on the other hand, we've also had a greater focus on things like entrepreneurship and technology to help foster innovation. In Africa, for instance, there's been several forums over the past year to bring on board the small and medium enterprises, the private sector, to work toward the SDGs. So when we're looking ahead, the food policy report talks about rural revitalization. And as you know, coming from this part of the world, rural development is a top priority of the EU, also many other regions of the world too, and one of the two pillars under the Common Agricultural Policy. And so according to the rural revitalization thinking, focusing on the needs of rural areas is a promising way to achieve the SDGs, and focusing on things like rural livelihoods, women's empowerment, environment, giving people access to basic services like electricity, helping people with jobs, gender equality. These are all needed to make rural places vibrant and healthy places to live and work. They bring up a term in the Global Food Policy Report, rurbanomics, rural-urban economics, I think it stands for. But this is an approach that frames the rural economies as equal partners with the urban economies and emphasizes these rural economies as key drivers for food security, environmental services, and so forth. So we think that increasing ag productivity and linking these rural and urban markets better are going to help the livelihoods in the rural areas, provide healthy diets and decently priced foods to the urban areas, but also spur job creation, entrepreneurship activities, and also slow the tide of youth migration. So we'll be talking about that a bit more as well. Switching gears and moving specifically into our field, our profession, what does this mean for extension and education? Let's look into the crystal ball and think what is going to be happening in the future in education and extension with regard to our policies, our practices, and our research. And my presentation is going to be looking at different models that are focused on sustainability and scale using systems approaches within both education and extension. Look at some hot topics, areas such as climate change, youth, mental health, and nutrition. And then the issue of competencies sort of comes after all of these as a result. Competencies for extension staff, for organizations of extension and education, and the leaders. We're also going to talk about professionalism. And one article that came up, and this looks actually surprisingly like my crystal ball, but it's actually the symbol for Siri, the Apple virtual search assistant. So one researcher, Dave King from Oregon State University, wrote this commentary, "Hey Siri, what's the future of extension?" And he's talking, at least from a US perspective, about the unprecedented competition that extension faces in the information marketplace. So extension competitors aren't just abstract concepts anymore. They're here on our devices, they're in our homes, they're on our smartphones. They're across all areas of our life. And I think his concern here is that, is this going to cause erosion of support for extension? Are the audiences all going to run after Google, Siri, and Alexa, or will they still come to us for advice? And he thinks this is actually an opportunity, but it's going to take a lot of understanding of who the competitors are within the information marketplace and for innovation. So this perspective is coming from a number of different places, this presentation today. A lot of global trends that we've been seeing, some articles like in Forbes and Harvard Business Review, thoughts from key thinkers of the field, that's you guys pretty much, but also some others. And then I've done some document search. I've gone on to some of the key ag, extension, and education journals and searched for future and trends and things like that. And then, of course, from all of you. There's a rumor going around that I sat down and read all the papers presented here. And I'm not going to confirm or deny that rumor, but I thought about it anyways. But we'll be referring to a lot of the excellent papers that we had here today as part of this. So moving right into the models, there were three elements I mentioned that are thinking toward the future. Models use these, or they're headed toward these three key elements. So we've been hearing all week about systems thinking and thinking holistically, AKIS and AIS. Another key concept that many developers of programs and projects is the issue of sustainability. Financially sustainability especially, but being there for your clients in the long term. And then also scale. How do we improve our reach? We have something that works really well in a little region or a pilot. How do we reach more people? How do we get this at the national level? So looking first at the systems thinking models, you might be surprised to see this old-fashioned linear transfer of technology treadmill approach that all of us are familiar with. It came out of the Green Revolution. It had this rationalistic bias, assuming that farmers behave rationally. If we give them good information, of course they're going to adopt it, right? Not true, but if you look at people's mindsets and project documents and what people write, this model is still in the back of people's minds. They might substitute the word agricultural innovation systems, but they're still thinking in a linear type of mode. They're still assuming that innovations come from research, it comes from science, and that they're the center of everything. It doesn't acknowledge the role of other actors within the innovation system, like the private sector, farmers, extension, and so forth. So we see extension's role here as just being a transmitter of knowledge. What we have today, and of course what all of you sort of propound, is the AKIS, or the Agricultural Innovation Systems approach. Much more messy, much more complex, but much more realistic than that linear treadmill. And there's a lot of new players who contribute to innovation. Pierre talked about the machinery dealers and the small and medium enterprises. And the lines are really becoming blurry about advisors and who's providing advisory services. It's not some guy in a uniform with a megaphone on a motorbike telling farmers how to plant maize. It's people helping farmers with taxes, with mental health issues, with all sorts of different things. There's many, many actors within the agricultural innovation system. So that's one of the key elements of the innovation system, is the actors. The interactions, how they share information, how they partner and make alliances, is another key component. And then the interactions, the policies, the rules of the game, that influence how these actors interact is another key element of innovation systems. So a lot of people are thinking more holistically as we move into the future. Sustainability. This, as I said, is being there for your clients in the long term if we're thinking of financial sustainability. And of course, cost sharing is one of the major elements of this. There's actually quite a nice document by the Global Forum for Rural Advisory Services Global Good Practices Initiative about innovative financing mechanisms, if you want to check that out. But cost-sharing models like privatization, semi-privatization are to try to get more cost-sharing and help share the load of the cost between different actors. Even the Farmer Field Schools model has a semi-privatized approach where you might get a grant, but then you're paying most of it back at the end. Secondly, the 4 Ps. So we have PPPs, everyone's heard of public-private partnerships, but now we have public-private producer partnerships where you bring in the farmer organizations as part of this partnership, contributing with their knowledge, their data, also paying in some cases. And we see an example of this with the Natal and Bai project in Senegal, for instance. Then we heard from Penn State the other day about a new extension model for the state of Pennsylvania, an extension business model. So they apparently switched from a traditional extension system to one that's more business driven and has a business model. And then lastly, I've picked up from South Africa the idea of impact farming. I'm not sure if this is around the world, but you can go and invest in some blueberries or some beehives, and you pay some money, you buy X number of blueberry plants or beehives, and then when the farmer or the producer harvests their product, you get some money back out of it. Can we insert extension somehow into this process and somehow get more impact for extension services that way? Something to discuss afterwards. And then lastly, crowdfunding. I've heard people talk about this as a way to fund extension. I've not seen any example, so I would love to hear from you. But the idea that people around the world on the internet are going to contribute to your bright idea in extension or education or agriculture is certainly an enticing one to think about. And then the issue of scale. This is closely linked with sustainability. Often approaches that help you scale also help you sustain. But there's 2 models I'll mention, the volunteer or the lead farmer, and then the digitally enabled extension. And the lead farmer approach is used in a number of countries. We've just finished conducting a study of 28 countries with the project that I lead, and they're all using these lead farmers, village agents. They're called by a lot of different things. But these are people in the rural areas who are connected to an extension program or project, often associated with producer organizations. They're acting as sort of a booster for extension in the rural areas. Now, granted, there's shortcomings. They don't have all the technical expertise and experience of an extension agent. They need backup by subject matter specialists. Sometimes they might need incentives, but the research by Franzel and other colleagues shows that the incentives aren't what you think. They don't need a salary necessarily. Some of them are incentivized by altruism. They're incentivized by getting respect from their local communities, by just having a sign in front of their house that says village agent, expert in such and such. So this is a model to help scale and make sustainable extension services. And then we have the digitally enabled or ICT-based extension services that use ICTs to enhance their work. This works for education as well, of course. This is not about replacing people with machines or with data. I think some people get all excited and say, I can run this project with no staff and just machines and it'll be really cheap. We still need people for the information, for the data, for the content of the ICTs, and then we also need them to back up and support the work as well. And a lot of people think that ICTs are basically about information delivery, which is true, but they're also about accessing finances via your mobile money or something like that, insurance services. It helps you to monitor and evaluate extension programs and staff. In South Africa, we've got a DigiPen with a smart Bluetooth, and as you're writing, it's sending messages back to your office about what the issues are, where you are, and sorts of things like that. And then, of course, capacity building for farmers and extension. We can use ICTs for this, 2 days ago, I left early so I could give a 2-hour webinar to the Caribbean Extension Providers Network, part of GFROS. They're going through a 18-month process of doing every one of the new extensionist modules that were produced by GFROS. And so we start off with a webinar, and then they go on and do some online training. At the same time I was on this Zoom platform, they asked me to do Facebook Live too, which was a bit scary, but it actually really worked really well. And even Illinois, one of the US states, is using this. This is a financial wellness session by extension in the United States, and a lot of the US extension are using Facebook Live. And this is useful because with the increasing youth population, people often think that youth are attracted to ICTs, and it's true that the youth these days are the so-called digital natives that have grown up with ICTs practically in their prams and their cribs. But they also help to reach marginalized groups, whether they're women or pastoralists. Even people with low literacy can be reached via certain ICTs. And in today's world of tightened budgets and calls for accountability from taxpayers and from others, this is a way to sort of get more bang for your buck. We're also in the day of big data and the knowledge economy. We heard several examples from Scotland and France about the precision farming and the data that's being fed into that. So these are some good uses of ICTs. And then if we look around the world too, everyone that I know is using cell phones and the internet. A lot of farmers are using social media for information. The farmers in Myanmar use Facebook as their primary means of getting information online. So that's the ICT model. Let's move to education, and keeping on that ICT idea, the idea of the MOOCs, the massive open online courses. We're going to also talk about Agrapreneurship, farmer field schools, and then learning competence from Professor Mulder. So this screenshot here shows us a glimpse of the reach of a certain MOOC by the World Bank Group on financing for development. And the benefits of MOOCs are that you can reach this large audience, diverse audience all around the world in different time zones and so forth. And it helps sort of democratize the learning and enable people to be able to access learning that they wouldn't normally be able to get. And the MOOCs serve as living repositories of knowledge that can be constantly changed and updated. If people want to get more information, they can dive in deeper through the internet and the use of perhaps other MOOCs. And then we have the idea of agripreneurship within the education field. So we've got these burgeoning populations, especially the rural youth. They often lack education, they often lack opportunities. In the country of South Africa, where I'm based, even if the economy were doing great, which it's not, it's totally terrible, it would take 30 years to absorb all the young people into the formal job market. So you can imagine with the bad economy how it's going to be. The formal job sector can't keep pace. We need entrepreneurial mindsets in agriculture. We need agripreneurs. And I think there's a role here for education in terms of formational training for both extension and farmers. We need continuing education and upskilling. There's a module within the GFROS New Extensionist on agripreneurship. And we need to think more about the ag technical vocational education and training that's so famous in Germany and other European countries. This is really being phased out in Africa and other places. They all want to become universities. And then where do people get their technical training? So the AT vets are very, very important, and it's important to bring in these types of topics, not only to AT vets, but also to other educational institutions as well. Farmer field schools, not a new model, but I think a model for the future. This group-based adult learning education approach that uses participatory learning via experimentation has proved to be remarkably adaptable. So starting back in 1989, we had the IPM, Integrated Pest Management Field Schools. And since then, farmer field schools have spread throughout the whole world. They have taken up an enormous number of topics, so it's not just about crops. We've got livestock field schools, climate field schools, farmer field and life schools, junior farmer field schools, business schools. And the farmer field schools easily integrate new topics into their curriculum. I've seen them integrate gender, HIV and AIDS, and then obviously climate and some other topics as well. Martin Mulder is just retired. But he presented this model in 2017, the 5-component future competence model. And I think this is important to think about because of those different competencies on the vertical and on the horizontal axis. So it comes with the idea that with the disciplinary and interdisciplinary competence on domains, let's talk about a farmer couple. The other day in the social learning session, we talked about how oftentimes couples play these multifunctional farmer roles. So you might have a dairy farm that also provides adult daycare for perhaps disabled people in Europe, let's say. So on the disciplinary domain that you see at the bottom, this couple needs information about like emission quotas and administration, feed systems, but they also need the mental health care information, care plans, activities, and special needs. Then there's the area of self-management and career competence up at the top. And here they need to be able to act as independent entrepreneurs and self-regulate their business and to plan their family life along with these two businesses that they have on their farm. We've got the personal professional domain on the left where this couple is going to have to be able to adapt to change. They can take advantage of opportunities like funding opportunities or new clientele and things like that. And then we have the social professional competence on the right. And in this domain, they need things like civic knowledge as they deal with different stakeholders and communicate with the different parties in both areas of their farm. So that's the future competence model. You can find out more about it in the JAEE cited there. And we can share this presentation with all of you. Moving on to issues, there's a number of issues. We've already mentioned youth. So here's how we define youth according to the United Nations. Ages 15 to 24, different countries define it differently. Currently 1.2 billion youth in the world. And there'll be 1.8 billion by 2050, and a lot of these will be in Africa. Coupled with that is this aging workforce that we've been talking about this week. Farmers are getting old, extension agents are getting old. Some of the people in this room have been around for a little while, the thinkers in extension and in education. How are we going to bring the youth in to become providers of extension services, but also the clientele? How are we going to engage them as clientele in extension services and in education as well? We talked the other day from the state of Florida about the use of agritourism, and is this an opportunity for youth, perhaps? But the issue is, how do we equip these youth to become entrepreneurs? There's also the issues of climate change and risk. Those of you following developments in southern Africa might have heard about these two devastating cyclones or hurricanes in Mozambique, Idai and Kenneth, where over 1,000 people died and there was a lot of devastation. And then India had a big cyclone where, if you read about it, Extension played this really proactive and useful role in helping people to deal with the hurricane. Mary Beth, if you're here, you can tell people a lot more about dealing with hurricanes and cyclones because she comes from Florida. But there's a special upcoming issue in the JAEE on dealing with uncertainty and crisis and risk. And actually this is being headed up by, one of the professors is from Florida and the other one is from Texas, where they experience hurricanes as well. And then lastly, the GFRAS annual meeting this year in Jamaica is on the topic of the role of extension in climate change and disaster risk management. So if you still want to keep talking to people about extension and include disaster, you can go to Jamaica at the end of September. I think there was a paper also from Egypt on the topic here this week. And then there's the issue of nutrition. I alluded to it in the earlier slides when we were talking about the background. We have these rising malnutrition rates. We have more focus on linkages between education within extension and also the food systems that people are involved with. So we need nutrition-sensitive food systems. We need the extension and the education to provide information here. And a lot of people think, hey, you know, with the infrastructure, the presence of extension in rural areas, can't they play a role in addressing nutrition issues? Can't we equip them with some knowledge about nutrition and help to deal with the issues of malnutrition and so forth? And there's a need, of course, to integrate nutrition into curricula for extension education. The question is, how far does one go? I mean, extension agents, they have their own technical competencies. You want to add gender issues to them. You want to add legal issues. You want to add nutrition issues. And nutrition can become somehow quite complex. So it's an issue to be considered. A lot of projects are doing it, but it's a question whether it's in the typical mandate of extension agents. And then the issues of mental health. We talked about this, as I mentioned, in that social farming, care farming session we had a couple of days ago. Also the pedagogic farms. So these, I think, are being used a lot in Europe to provide social interaction, therapy, education for disadvantaged groups, for children, for the elderly, on farms, and to help them learn where their milk comes from, for instance, in the case of children. And we talked in the opening session and in different sessions this week about the high death rate, the high suicide rate of farmers as compared to other members of the community. We talked about farmer stress in Ireland. What are the perceptions about the stress that farmers face there? What's the role of extension here? What should extension be doing? I know a lot of times we feel like we're psychologists or psychiatrists in our jobs, but where do we draw the line? Where do we say, this is too much, let me hand it to another type of professional? But we have to see how best can we support our clientele, what are their needs, and so forth. And then finally, looking at the capacities and competencies. So this is based on the earlier inputs with regard to the models and the issues, but there's a certain number of technical competencies that extension needs, that education provides, but there's also functional competencies. And then there's a lot of organizational competencies and competencies that leaders in extension education need. There's emotional competencies, and then I'm going to address the issue of professionalism, which is quite closely linked, as you'll see. With the GFROS New Extensionist Learning Kit that I mentioned earlier, this is a 13-module online. You can download it. You can use it for free. It's got a Creative Commons license. But it's identified about 12 key core competencies for the global extension agents, things like facilitating groups, communication, use of ICTs, dealing with risk and change. And this is what I was teaching with this Caribbean group a couple of days ago. But these are the so-called functional competencies and the soft skills, which if you look across, at least in Africa and parts in Latin America for sure, there's not a lot of the functional competencies taught as people are getting their foundational training. They'll learn about crops, they'll learn about livestock, they'll learn about natural resource management, but they won't learn how to communicate, and that's their job, is to communicate. And so this is really critical. It needs to be built into more educational institutions. And then there's a lot of organizational capacities and competencies, and this is coming from the New Extensionist, it's coming from the FAO corporate strategy that Degi presented the other day. Also, Susanna Winden had presented about leadership development, and there's a lot of capacities and competencies that are needed by extension organizations and also by leaders in extension and education, and it's quite overwhelming, but extension is facing a lot of challenges, agriculture is facing a lot of challenges. They need all of these competencies to be able to deal with it, and they need to know how to work with other people to do so, because you can't do it alone. These are all things you don't open a textbook and learn about. You have to kind of learn on the job and learn by doing. So it's a challenge to get these competencies across, and it's something we should think about for the future. Emotional competencies. When I first started thinking about this speech, emotional intelligence came into my mind, and then I was thinking, oh goodness, people are going to think I'm crazy and very sensitive. But as I've been listening to all of you this week, it's been clear that this is a critical element of extension and education. And emotional intelligence is defined as the capacity to reason and to analyze your emotional information. You've got, on the personal side, self-awareness, what you're feeling, self-management, being able to regulate what you feel. And then on the social side, you've got the empathy, how you feel for other people, your clientele, your students. And then there's the relationship management. These are all parts of emotional intelligence. if you take two people who have the same technical qualities, the same knowledge, if you look at what makes one person more successful than the other, 90% of this comes from EQ, the emotional intelligence. And if you look at the company Google, they're taking EQ as a much more important criteria in searching for candidates than their IQ and their knowledge and stuff like that. So the question is, what is education and extension in agriculture doing with the emotional intelligence of their staff? Are they aware of it? Do they know how to build this emotional intelligence and to get it into their staff? And then lastly, related to this, the issues of professionalism, regulation, and certification. Again, in France, we were talking the other day that some people think, pest providers shouldn't be able to advise as well. They shouldn't get a certification as an advisor. In the EU, Michael can tell you more about this. We have the certificate for European consultants in rural areas to provide the competencies for advisors in the EU. In countries like Uganda and South Africa, there's new regulations, registration, certification for different pluralistic providers. So in Uganda, for instance, they've just launched a new code of ethics and a new way to register as an extension provider and to eventually be certified. The same in South Africa. They've just been certified as a profession under the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions. And now everyone's got to turn in a whole lot of paperwork and prove that they have the foundational training, what level they should be at, and then they're required to do continuing education as well. So, back to our crystal ball. What does this mean for our future? I think the future of extension is looking very much like we should be experimenting with and trying sustainable and scaled approaches. Extension for the future needs to be sort of enabled by ICT, but without using that human element. We need to think about the youthfulness, engaging more youth, and I'm happy to see a number of younger people in the audience today who are going to take up the reins. Agrapreneurial, we need to think more about agrapreneurial competencies and so forth. Emotionally intelligent, and then we need people who are able to adapt and to change and to respond. And so my challenge, as you all head back to work, think about the future, what do you want? How can we prepare for the future? I want to think about how do we address this in our research, in our practice, in our policy making, in agricultural extension and education. So I hope to see more of these issues and also new ones as we go into the future, as we meet next year, and also in the journal, the JAEE. So Lawrence had announced, I think in the opening keynote, that it's just achieved an impact factor. So we've got the numbers today. And those of you who follow it, so we have a 1.388 impact factor in the social sciences index. So that's a huge achievement for the journal and for our profession. And so we hope to see more of this in those journals, in the interactions as we come in the future, and then as we work together. So with that, I'll thank you very much and turn it back to the organizers.